So I'm delighted this evening to welcome you to this online lecture presented by Tom Bartlett for the Centre culturel irlandais to mark the bicentenary this year of the death of Napoleon. And I'm going to hand over now to Rory Montgomery, former ambassador, Irish ambassador to France and diplomat, and also recently elected member of the Royal Irish Academy. Really just within the past couple of months, Rory, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
So I'll hand over to you, Rory, and we'll be delighted to hear you introducing this evening's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Nora. I'm also, of course, the Vice Chair of the Comité Stratégique of the Centre culturel, so I'm really pleased to be able to take part in this evening's event. Tom Bartlett, who's going to speak to you about Napoleon in Ireland, he's the Professor Emeritus of Irish History at the University of Aberdeen. He was formerly Professor of Modern Irish History at University College Dublin. He's published widely on many aspects of Irish history, and notably on the 18th century. And most recently, he was the general editor of the 4-volume Cambridge History of Ireland, which was published a couple of years ago. Tom has generously said that he's happy to take questions or comments at the end of his talk. So Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much. Bonsoir mes amis, bonsoir mesdames, messieurs. J'étais très heureux d'être invité de vous parler sur les liens et sur le sujet de Napoléon Bonaparte et ses liens avec Irlande. Très heureux d'être invité et très heureux d'être là sur Zoom. Et merci à Rory pour ces mots. Et maintenant, je vais parler en anglais. Je crois que c'est mieux comme ça. Okay. Napoleon Bonaparte and Ireland. Now, this is a subject on which much could be written. It's not just the involvement of Napoleon Bonaparte with the plans of Theobald Wolfe Tone and Robert Emmet to conjure up a French army of invasion into Ireland during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Such projects are matters of historical record for which documents exist, which can be assessed and evaluated. More than this, however, is the historical significance of Napoleon, his meaning, first in Irish popular consciousness in the long 19th century, and second, his place in Irish revolutionary thinking in terms of obtaining military assistance from abroad. In an Irish context, to an extent, these twin aspects of Napoleon's legacy, the popular and the revolutionary, can be separated and seen as, on the one part, Napoleonism, essentially a sentimental, nostalgic, romantic view of the emperor, preoccupied with his victories, his achievements, his sayings, and the affecting circumstances surrounding his exile and death in St. Helena. Who could not feel to be moved by a swift fall from being emperor of pretty much half the world to being confined to a lump of rock in the South Atlantic? This view of Napoleon, I think, is largely devoid of political content. Against that, there's something which we may call Bonapartism, which was overtly political and potentially revolutionary. It equated Bonaparte with the French Revolution, with republicanism, and of course, ignored blithely the inconvenient truths about Napoleon. He was, after all, the man who brought an end to the French Republic. He suppressed all legislative opposition. He practiced the most draconian censorship in French history. He organized a police force of redoubtable efficiency. He re-established a nobility, and he reimposed slavery in France's Caribbean colonies. But nonetheless, he was admired for what was seen as his marrying of martial vigor with civic virtue. And in Ireland, of course, he was admired for being an implacable foe of England. These two paths, these two routes, I suppose, Napoleonism, sentimental, Bonapartism, potentially revolutionary, were to converge in Ireland, I think, in 1916. But first, as in all assessments of Napoleon and his impact, the primary difficulty is always in separating fact from fantasy, myth from reality, and prizing apart the legend, the legacy, and the whimsy. May I illustrate this point briefly? It was recorded in 1819 that but for the quick-thinking efforts of an Irish priest, Napoleon would never have been able to conquer half the world. Indeed, the world would never have heard of him. Father Edward Redmond, parish priest of Ferns in County Wexford, apparently made a dramatic rescue of the boy Bonaparte, who had fallen into a river near the college where Redmond was studying. Redmond pulled him to safety, and the rest is what? History or fantasy? Then there are the many Irish connections of Napoleon's family. We can, I think, disregard the claim that Napoleon's grandfather on his mother's side was an O'Donovan from Kilkenny. There's no evidence for this. We are on firmer ground in pointing out that Napoleon's older brother, Joseph, married the daughter of Francis Clary, an Irish merchant in Marseille. She eventually became Queen of Spain. And Jerome, the youngest of Napoleon's brothers, married Elizabeth Patterson, the daughter of an Irish merchant in Baltimore, USA, much to Napoleon's displeasure. As for Napoleon himself, we learn that in his youth, he was rejected by Désirée Clary, another daughter of Francis Clary and the sister of Joseph's wife. According to Montholon, a sort of Boswell to Napoleon in exile, Désirée remained thereafter Napoleon's one true love. She subsequently married Marshal Bernadotte, a bitter rival of Napoleon, and eventually became Queen of Sweden. One writer has indeed mused, it is interesting to speculate whether the career of Napoleon might have been different if he had married her with her splendid character and qualities, rather than Josephine de Beauharnais, an adventuress of dubious morals. Leaving genealogy to one side, there is the claim of the well-known silversmiths, Bradfords of Clonmel, County Tipperary, that Napoleon used to shave with razors made by them. So who could refute this boast, and who would want to? By appointment to the emperor. And of course, there is Napoleon's favorite stallion, Marengo, named after his famous victory in Italy in 1801, a horse that carried him through Austerlitz, Wagram, the Russian campaign of 1812, and Waterloo, being wounded many times. It died aged 38 years and remained a prime attraction in circuses and shows. And its skeleton is on display today, as we speak, in the National Army Museum in Chelsea, London. Some years ago, it was the subject of a charming biography. Now, given the well-attested Irish love for horses, it was, I think, inevitable that a claim would be made for Irish ownership. Marengo is frequently asserted to have been bred in Wexford and purchased at the horse fair in Ballinasloe, County Galway, for the sum of 100 guineas. Not surprisingly, the local tourist office in Ballinasloe is rather protective of the connection, and there is today a rather fine restaurant in the town, the Marengo, which celebrates the Napoleonic link. Now, is any of this true? The family details are supported by the evidence, but the rest, I fear, is problematic. Intriguingly, Bonaparte claimed to have suffered a near-death experience as a 17-year-old youth in France. His story of a near drowning surfaced in Barry O'Mara's Napoleon in Exile, or A Voice from St. Helena, which was published in 1822. However, in this version, Bonaparte maintained that he managed to struggle ashore unaided. There's no mention of a priest. On the other hand, the story was current in Wexford in 1812. Father Redmond died in 1818, four years before O'Mara's book came out. Redmond's role in the incident was brought to a wider audience in Father Kavanagh's A Popular History of the Wexford Insurrection of 1798, which was first published in 1870. The story is, I think, best regarded as unproven, but it's still significant that a connection between a Wexford priest and Napoleon was thought worthwhile to make as late as 1870. As for Marengo, the available evidence seems to point to the horse being of Barbary stock and as having been captured or purchased in the aftermath of the Battle of Aboukir Bay in Egypt. The Ballinasloe connection may date from Thackeray's novel Vanity Fair, 1847, where the words Marengo, Ballinasloe, and horse appear in the same sentence. We are on firmer ground in addressing Bonaparte's connection with the United Irishmen. From the 1690s on, successive Irish governments had kept a close eye on French military planning that might conceivably include an invasion of Ireland. And French officer cadets in the French military academies had routinely been set as an exercise, an incursion into Ireland. Little had come of these fears. But by the mid-1790s, the French revolutionary authorities had begun to take seriously a descent on Ireland. At the very least, a small French force would tie up a large number of British soldiers. At best, it might even succeed. Look at what Bonaparte had done in Italy with a small army in 1796-97. Ireland could be perhaps another Italy for a lucky French general. Ireland would be detached from Britain, and thus France would be deprived of a vital supply of recruits for her army and navy, and of provisions for both. The future Hibernian Republic would join the Cisalpine Republic, the Batavian Republic, the Parthenopean Republic, and others as satellite republics of France. Britain would thereby be surrounded, would have no alternative but to surrender. In addition, and no small matter, an invasion of Ireland would undoubtedly ignite a sectarian civil war, and would therefore be a well-deserved payback for William Pitt, the British Prime Minister, who had, in French theory, had infamously stirred up counter-revolution in the Vendée region, and had acted as paymaster to the counter-insurgency there. Ireland could be Pitt's Vendée. Now, we know that Theobald Wolfe Tone, one of the founders of the United Irishmen, had a number of meetings with Napoleon Bonaparte between December 1797 and January 1798. As the recent conqueror of Italy, Napoleon's reputation was soaring, and news of his victories over the Austrians had penetrated the most remote parts of Europe. Miles Byrne, a United Irishman and later soldier in the Grand Armée, more than 60 years later, recalled what he called the happy days in Monaseed, County Wexford, when, with pulse racing, quote, we used to read at the chapel the newspapers giving an account of Napoleon's brilliant campaigns from 1795 down to the Peace of Campo Formio in 1797. Around the same time as Byrne was reading about Napoleon's exploits, a man was arrested in Oranmore, County Galway, for drinking this toast: Gevecamid Horsea, a crocul a corda, agus a kraken Marbroga or Bonaparte. May we see George the King, George III, hanged by a rope and his skin used for boots for Bonaparte. And when Henry O'Kane, who had just disembarked with General Humbert at Killala, County Mayo, in September 1798, when he sought to impose his will on the local inhabitants, he was accustomed to wave his weapon above his head and claim, quote, the sword he had in his hand was given to him by General Bonaparte. And in the folklore associated with the French raid in 1798, allegedly headed by General Humbert, it was Bonaparte that was at its head, not the obscure Humbert. Tank Tana Frankie and Ish, the Stiga Killala, agus Baimage Galahan Lager, the Bonaparte at Gashlan Awari, Igiri and Juli Chapt Sharshal. The French are now in Killala, and we will be broad and strong. Bonaparte is now in Castlebar, seeking to enact Sarsfield's law. But more elevated witnesses could also be swept aside by Napoleon's awesome reputation. In May 1798, Lieutenant General James Stewart rather rashly announced that he had in fact captured Napoleon Bonaparte off the Cork coast. So given Napoleon's extraordinary military standing throughout Europe, it was no wonder, therefore, that a rather odd Tone should comment in his diary in November 1797 that it is droll enough that he, an Irish exile, a relative unknown, with no military standing, travelling under the nom de plume of James Smith, should be writing to Bonaparte seeking an interview. The pair duly met during the 3rd week of December 1797 at Bonaparte's house in the Rue Chantereine. Here is Tone's account. December 1821, 1797. He, Bonaparte, lives in the greatest simplicity. His house is small but neat, and all the furniture and ornaments are in the most classical taste. He is about 5'6" high and well made, but stoops considerably. He looks at least 10 years older than he is, owing to the great fatigues he underwent in his immortal campaign of Italy. His face is that of a profound thinker, but bears no mark of that great enthusiasm and unceasing activity by which he has been so much distinguished. It is rather, to my mind, the countenance of a mathematician than of a general. He has a fine eye and a great firmness about his mouth. He speaks low and hollow, so much for his manner and figure. But as for Ireland and Irish affairs, we have to say that Tone recorded his disappointment that Bonaparte appears a good deal uninformed. For example, he seems convinced that our population is not more than 2 million, which is nonsense. Bonaparte listened but said little. Another of Bonaparte's Irish visitors recorded that the great man believed that Ireland was infested with wolves. Yet another recalled that Bonaparte seemed to understand that the noble island of Ireland seemed to understand nothing of this noble island of Ireland more than to have a general idea of religious difference. He erroneously thought the entire country was Catholic. A further meeting on the 23rd of December lasted just 5 minutes, during which Napoleon asked for further materials on Ireland. Tone recorded, "His manner is cold and he speaks very little. It is not, however, so dry as that of General Lazare Hoche, but seems rather to proceed from languor than anything else. He is perfectly civil to us, but from anything we have yet seen or heard from him, it is impossible to augur anything good or bad. We have now seen the greatest man in Europe 3 times, and I am astonished how little I have to record about him. Yet, after all, it is a droll thing that I should become acquainted with Bonaparte." A final meeting took place on the 13th of January 1798. Tone recorded that he and Edward Lewins, another United Irishman, met Bonaparte and handed over further Irish memoranda and maps of Ireland. Tone told him that the United Irishmen in Paris were eager to be involved in any invasion by the Armée d'Angleterre. Finally, writes Tone, "I spoke of myself." He expressed his great desire to be on the staff for the forthcoming invasion. Bonaparte assured him that he would be. But then Tone made a shamefaced confession. He had to admit that he had next to no military experience or knowledge, to which Bonaparte replied in a phrase which I imagine was to set Irish nationalist hearts pounding during the 19th century, "Mais vous êtes brave." Tone modestly replied that when the opportunity offered, he hoped that that would be the case, to which Bonaparte rejoined, "Eh bien, cela suffit." They parted, never to meet again. Napoleon, within a matter of months, would go off to Egypt, not Ireland, while Tone, in what may have been a reckless move, sailed for Ireland in October 1798, only to be captured and dying in prison by his own hand. 12 years later, after Tone's death, Tone's widow, Matilda, had an encounter with Napoleon. Since her husband's death, she had lived quietly in France, existing on the pension paid to her by the French government, awarded after some prompting by Lucien Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother. She had spent her time caring for her family, but had suffered the heartache of seeing all of her children, except William, die of consumption. William was to be her sole surviving child, and she was determined that when he came of age, he would be enrolled in the Imperial Army's prestigious School of Cavalry. Accordingly, in 1810, she applied to the Duc de Feltre, Minister of War, to place her son there. De Feltre, otherwise known as Henry Clark, was of Irish Jacobite stock, and he had worked closely with Theobald Wolfe Tone in preparation for a French invasion of Ireland. But despite these connections, de Feltre believed he owed the Tones no special favours and he ruled that young William would become an officer cadet in Napoleon's Irish Legion, at that time serving in Spain. With formidable resolve, Matilda decided to bring her case to the Emperor Napoleon's attention. Now, it was well known that when in Paris, Napoleon hunted regularly in the forest of Saint-Germain. And so Matilda conceived a plan, in effect, to ambush the emperor when his carriage halted to change horses, and to thrust a bound essay by William, along with her memorial detailing her claim on France, into his hands. Matilda continued. Very soon the carriage with the emperor and empress drove into the circle in the forest. The horses were changed as quickly as I had thought, but I stepped up and presented the book and the memorial. The emperor took them, and handing the book to his groom, opened the paper. I have said it commenced by recalling Tone to his memory. When Napoleon began to read, he said, Tone, with an expressive accent. I remember him well. Je m'en souviens bien. Napoleon quizzed Matilda about her circumstances. She described her modest life at Saint-Germain and explained further about her son. The emperor promised to look into the matter, and the carriage departed. The incident was the talk of Saint-Germain. Who was that strange woman who had taken the Emperor of France by his collar? Matilda Tone's efforts proved successful, for William obtained his government scholarship and never served in the Irish Legion. Napoleon's later dealings with the United Irishmen proved not so happy. After the failure of the 98 rebellion and the non-arrival of a large French force, the remnants of the United Irishmen were reluctant to put too much trust in French promises of further assistance. Robert Emmet travelled to France in the aftermath of the 1798 rebellion and made contact with leading members of the consulate. It's unclear whether he ever met Napoleon. His biographers are divided on this point, but it seems very unlikely. And there's no evidence to support a meeting. We can be confident that Emmet and others did meet French officials, but the abiding impression they took away from these contacts was one of deep suspicion concerning French intentions towards Ireland. Certainly Thomas Addis Emmet, Robert's eldest brother, hated Napoleon for, as he saw it, betraying republicanism, and he doubted whether Napoleon had ever had any intention of invading Ireland or liberating Ireland. Arthur O'Connor, a very bitter rival of Thomas Addis Emmet, unlikely denounced also that, what he called that enemy of anything but liberty, Bonaparte. Robert Emmet came to share this verdict. However, despite the doubts over Napoleon's intentions, or indeed over whether or not he and Robert Emmet had ever met, Irish nationalists in the late 19th century had no hesitation about pressing Robert Emmet and Napoleon Bonaparte into their patriotic iconography. When the legend and the facts conflict, print the legend. Finally, at least in terms of the historical record, we come to the Irish Legion, renamed in 1809 le 3e Régiment étranger Irlandais, which was raised by Napoleon Bonaparte and the resumption of war with England in 1803, and disbanded on his defeat in 1815. The Legion story is not a very happy one. It had an undistinguished, not to say unfortunate, history. No Fontenoy or Cremona adorns its battle honours. And while its officers were at least initially Irish-born or of Irish extraction, its rank and file consisted mostly of Polish or Prussian conscripts, with a mixture of British, Irish and Scottish deserters or former prisoners of war. The Legion, in its short history, had a notorious reputation for indiscipline, insubordination, and rancorous feuding that left at least one man dead, a number wounded, and caused others to give up in despair. At least one colonel deserted to the British Army. Raised specifically for service in Ireland, it never saw action in that country, spent its early years kicking its heels in enforced idleness in Brittany. All in all, its disbandment under the restored Bourbons, possibly at the insistence of Lord Castlereagh, the Irish-born Lord Castlereagh, then Foreign Secretary, comes as something of a relief from its squabbles and factionalism. Now, little of this was known in Ireland, nor indeed of Napoleon's vagueness where Ireland was concerned. On the contrary, despite a very concerted British effort to demonize Bonaparte in pamphlet, broadside, and print, and to detail the misery visited on the countries he had invaded, the Irish Catholic reaction to Napoleon's exploits, his adventures and victories was overwhelmingly positive. The success of Bonaparte on the continent has occasioned great joy and exultation among many of the Catholics, wrote one official from Dublin Castle in 1806. Yet another official in the same year wrote that the country people are becoming great politicians of late and meet in clubs to read the accounts of Bonaparte. Agrarian insurgents in County Waterford in the 1810s reportedly drank health and success to Bonaparte, and elsewhere in the county the toast was Bonaparte and our religion. Admittedly, the best efforts, Catholic priests made great efforts to label Napoleon an infidel and ogre. His treatment of the Pope, treatment of the Catholic Church, none of this made any impression whatsoever. It was comprehensively ignored. As one Dublin Castle official put it rather wearily, if Bonaparte could bring the Pope to the top of Tara Hill and guillotine him there, he would not lose 10 followers the less for it in Ireland. The progress of the war in Spain was followed with rapt attention by both Dublin Castle and the whole population of Ireland, which means the Catholics, as Dublin Castle report had it. People, even poor people, claimed Joseph Trail, talk and think of nothing but Napoleon's successes and the expected invasion. The minds of all the parties in the Catholic body are turned towards the events in Spain, noted Edward Littlehales. Whenever any bad news arrived from the Iberian Peninsula, wrote the Orange champion John Gifford in 1809, the walls of Dublin are immediately covered with placards, and you can see joy in every popish countenance, insolence in their eyes, and malice in their manner. When things are better, as now they are supposed to be, all is stillness and tranquility. 5 years on, the news from the Spanish front was better still. The prospect on the continent has again brightened, wrote Lord Sidmouth to Peel, and the barometer of turbulence and disaffection on your side of the water has, I suppose, again fallen. And Whitworth, the Lord Lieutenant at the time, looked forward to the end of Bonaparte, as it will be the last and best remedy for Irish disaffection. Of course, news of Bonaparte's escape from Elba and the ensuing 100 days of frenzied political, diplomatic, and military activity was followed avidly in Ireland. The lower orders, it was reported, were highly gratified at his progress, and his adventures had caused a ferment in Ireland. Nor were the disaffected in Ireland all that cast down by Bonaparte's defeat and exile to St. Helena, or so it was claimed. In September 1815, 3 months after Waterloo, it was said that, quote, the insurgents in Tipperary still expect Bonaparte. And in November of that year, a correspondent of Under Secretary William Gregory wrote that the disaffected still clung to, quote, the absurd idea of French help, which is a result of false prophecies circulated among them for the purposes of delusion. But even before Waterloo, Napoleon Bonaparte had passed into legend in Ireland. In France and in Britain, the Napoleonic legend may have rested almost entirely on his actions during the 100 days, when the great man attempted to follow what might be called a liberal agenda in French politics. But in Ireland, long before this, he was seen as a messianic figure, destined to bring deliverance to the Irish, a messiah that travelled a well-trodden road. In 1810, near Dunlavin in County Wicklow, a large crowd gathered to hear a poet, one Doyle. He read and sang, and as he did so, 2 figures appeared, none other than Napoleon and his empress in effigy. And in August 1815, as news of Bonaparte's fall was being confirmed, at a gathering near Omagh, County Tyrone, a Catholic leader, one Rafferty, addressed the crowd. Those that stick well with me shall get a townland in some part of Ireland. The crowd cheered him, at first called him King James, and afterwards Bonaparte. As is well known, Napoleon was accompanied to St. Helena by Dr. Barry O'Mara, an Irish medical doctor who had been trained in the College of Surgeons and then served in the Royal Navy. Apparently, Napoleon was taken with O'Mara's command of Italian, which of course was Bonaparte's first language, and asked for him to stay on as his medical person. And the two men became subsequently what we might call rather respectful friends. St. Helena was little more than a chunk of volcanic rock in the South Atlantic, reputedly populated by vast numbers of pink-eyed rats and with a rather inhospitable climate. The governor, of course, Hudson Lowe, may well have been Irish-born, but he quickly turned against his fellow Irishman, O'Mara. Lowe was a martinet, a deeply insecure man who feared that an attempt would be made to rescue Bonaparte. And to prevent such an escape, he would make Napoleon's life miserable and visit as much humiliation on him as possible. He insisted that O'Mara, as a British officer, must forget his duty to his patient as a doctor and instead spy on the emperor. Until 1818, when O'Mara was sacked, a battle of wits ensued between the governor and the doctor. But it was O'Mara who had the last laugh. Removed from his position and then cashiered, sacked from the Royal Navy with loss of pension, O'Mara wrote up his detailed diaries of his stay in St. Helena and published them in 1822 as Napoleon in Exile, or A Voice from St. Helena. The work, like that of de las Casas on Napoleon's exile, Memorial de Sainte Helene, was received enthusiastically by an English reading public that had remained fascinated by Napoleon. O'Mara became the authentic source of quotations and opinions that the general public, starved of news of the great man, wished to hear. The French Revolution offered, according to Napoleon, as reported by O'Mara, la carrière ouverte au talent. The English were nothing but une nation de boutiquiers, nation of shopkeepers. And as for the military, with perhaps a nod at Theobald Wolfe Tone, Napoleon claimed, I love a brave soldier who has undergone le baptême de feu, whatever nation he may belong to. Curiously, Bonaparte, for the most part, treated O'Mara as an English officer and seemed scarcely to realize that he was Irish. Sadly, the emperor's much quoted regret that he had not invaded Ireland instead of Russia, a quotation that found itself into a late 19th century Kiltartan history book, owes its origin to de las Casas' reminiscences, not those of O'Mara. More relevant, perhaps certainly more pertinent, was Napoleon's verdict on the United Irishmen that he had encountered. O'Mara revealed that he was dismissive of them. If the Irish had sent over honest men to me, I would certainly have made an attempt upon Ireland. But I had no confidence in either the integrity or the talents of the Irish leaders who were in France. They could offer no plan, were divided in opinion, and constantly quarrelling with one another. I had a poor opinion of that Arthur O'Connor, who was so much spoken of amongst you. As for Theobald Wolfe Tone, I have to say that despite the Je m'en souviens bien of earlier times, he figures nowhere in Napoleon's table talk, nor indeed can I find any reference to him in Napoleon's voluminous correspondence, which was published posthumously. O'Mara's book had a huge success, and his earnings from it and from the rapid French translation more than compensated for his loss of employment and pension. Hudson Lowe sued for libel, but the case collapsed because of delays. In quick order, O'Mara married the much older Lady Theodosia Lee, née Broughton, a wealthy and twice married widow. Her first husband had been hanged for murdering her brother, and her second marriage had ended in divorce in 1818. O'Mara was taken up by the opposition centred on Holland House, and he was befriended by Daniel O'Connell, who regarded Napoleon, quote, as an unfortunate great man. O'Mara went on to help found the new Reform Club. He died in 1836, apparently of a chill caught at one of O'Connell's meetings. But long before his death, Napoleon Bonaparte had passed from history into mythology. In death, he was to achieve a reputation, an apotheosis even, that had been denied or disputed in his lifetime. He achieved this not just in France, but in many parts of the world, and especially in Ireland. I want now to draw attention to some of the ways that Napoleon Bonaparte was remembered in Ireland in the 19th century, in Gaelic poetry, in ballads, in folklore, in folk plays, in the theatre, and in the early 20th century in film. But this, curiously, Irish novels about Napoleon are few and far between in the 19th century. But this does not mean that the revolutionary and Napoleonic period was neglected, far from it. But the scores of novels set in those times were almost entirely taken up with the 1798 rebellion and with the insurrection and death of Robert Emmet. However, if novels featuring Napoleon were scarce, such was not the case with poetry in Irish. The Royal Irish Academy's Corpus Nagilica, 1600-1880, has many references to poems in which variously Boan, Bona, and especially Boni or Bonapartig made an appearance. Almost all of these poems praised him as, amongst other things, an Gasciach Real Shin Boni, that regal hero Boni, who had laid low, amazingly, Oliver Cromwell, William III, and Henry VIII, and who it was predicted would return to Ireland one sunny day, La Grania. In the English language, numerous ballads were published in Ireland relating to Napoleon Bonaparte, vivid testimony to his hold on the public imagination long after his death. Some of these ballads were probably written in England, where something like a cult of Bonaparte existed until the 1850s, and some were adapted to Irish circumstances. Others were older Irish ballads or poems, for the latter were frequently sung rather than recited, and they were duly updated to include Bonaparte. And here it must be remembered that a central theme in Irish poetry was the notion of the deliverance of Ireland by foreign intervention. At one time, James II, or Bonnie Prince Charlie, had been the deliverer or messiah who would free Ireland. But now Napoleon passed seamlessly into this tradition. Here is one of them from the 1850s. One night, sad and languid, I lay in my bed, and I scarce had reclined on my pillow, when a vision surprising came into my head. I thought I was crossing the billow. Napoleon appears and speaks. On the plains of Marengo, I tyranny hurled, wherever my banner the eagle unfurled. 'Twas the standard of freedom all over the world. To liberty's temple I guided mankind, and slavery sought to keep under. The fetters of bondsmen I oft did unbind, tyrants' treaties I tore them asunder. In this way, the image of Bonaparte as a universal liberator, friend of the people, and democrat was being created, cemented, and passed on to posterity. Now, some years ago, the late Frank Hart, with Donal Lunny, produced a double CD in Dublin entitled My Name is Napoleon Bonaparte. It consisted of 26 Irish ballads on Napoleon. A tiny sample of the titles would include The Bonny Bunch of Roses, The Green Linnet, Napoleon's Farewell to Paris, I Am Napoleon Bonaparte, and my favourite, Napoleon is the Boy for Kicking Up a Row, and finally, Napoleon's Farewell. Not all of these ballads were tributes to Napoleon. Some were traditional anti-war songs, and several lamented that Napoleon had been the cause of the death of a loved one who had taken the king's shilling, the queen's shilling, I suppose, and enlisted in the British Army, only to perish or suffer mutilation, peg legs replacing real legs, as a result of the Battle of Waterloo in particular. But most were a lament for the lost hero, the Green Linnet, a gallant ally who would surely one day return to sting the bonny bunch of roses that is the British Army. We may note in passing that James Joyce was sufficiently impressed with the Napoleonic cult to include mention of Bonaparte in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, where Napoleon's alleged statement that the happiest day of my life was when I made my first Holy Communion is quoted without comment. And in Ulysses, Paris 1922, there are no fewer than 11 references to Bonaparte, including one where the great man is listed as one of the many Irish heroes and heroines of antiquity. He put Bonaparte alongside Shane O'Neill, Father Murphy of Bullavogue, and Theobald Wolfe Tone. But Joyce, mischievous as ever, rather spoiled the effect by also including in his role of Irish heroes the last of the Mohicans, the man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo, and the Queen of Sheba. More to the point, and tellingly, I think, he described Leopold Bloom in Ulysses as sporting a Napoleonic forelock. If Irish balladry could be said to have kept Bonaparte's name alive and to have helped in the creation of the image of Napoleon as a benevolent ruler and liberal democrat, so too did the popular memory of Bonaparte as revealed in the records of Irish folklore. A search through the folklore archive in the Department of Irish Folklore and University College Dublin reveals a significant number of references to Napoleon Bonaparte. Daniel O'Connell, obviously another deliverer, has a large mass of references in folklore. Oliver Cromwell is next with much fewer, but Napoleon is a respectable third, probably ahead of Wolfe Tone and certainly ahead of Robert Emmet. In Irish folklore, certain stories about Bonaparte appeared that were found elsewhere in Europe, that he was unaffected and had simple tastes. He was gentle to his soldiers, no flogging as in Wellington's army. He allowed his men to dress him in the familiar way with two. A story very common in France, but found in Ireland and elsewhere, was that Napoleon had never in fact died, or in Irish folklore near Cailloux-Rioué. Interesting, and by way of confirmation, a French traveller in Ireland in the 1840s was told by a turf cutter that Napoleon was not dead at all. That fellow in St. Helena was not really him at all. Bonaparte was hidden away in some impenetrable place and would emerge when the time was come. Other stories represent Napoleon as the all-forgiving wise ruler, literally a gentleman. Here is one from West Kerry, an Irish-speaking area collected in the 1930s, entitled An Far Fara Ina Culla, the Sleeping Sentry, La Sentinelle qui dort, a story that is found elsewhere in Europe. It begins, Vicach mor idir Bonaparte leis na slua Francach is na Austrians ur san Idail. There was a big battle one time between the French and Austrian armies in Italy. The Austrians were defeated, the day went to the French. That night, the French slept soundly in the open air, and Bonaparte posted sentries around them in case the Austrians returned. Just before midnight, Bonaparte rose from his bed to check that everything was in order around his camp. On his walk around the camp perimeter, he came across a sentry who was fast asleep, his musket on the ground. Napoleon took up the sentry's weapon and stood guard in his stead. After about an hour, the sentry awoke and was startled to find that his musket was missing. He was also taken aback to see Napoleon in front of him with the gun in his hands. Understandably, he reckoned that he would pay dearly for his transgression. But no, gentle Napoleon merely said that he understood that the sentry was tired after the hard day's battle. No harder battle was ever fought, but that from now on he would have to do his duty, for the enemy could yet destroy the French with a surprise attack. The sentry thanked Napoleon, resumed his post, and never again failed in his duty. This story is found from Poland to the United States, where Abraham Lincoln takes the role of Napoleon Bonaparte. And there are other stories of this like this as well. Alongside the ballads, the poems, and the folklore, there is the public memory of Napoleon, of Josephine, his horse Marengo, and the Battle of Waterloo. There were numerous reenactments, restagings, circus acts, popular melodrama. In all of this, Napoleon, or a version of him and his entourage, lived on long after his death. In 1816, to great acclaim, Bonaparte's carriage was exhibited in London, along with his personal wardrobe, his horses, and his Dutch coachman, Jan Horn. The exhibition later moved to Dublin, where it was equally enthusiastically received. Among other examples of the Irish public's fascination with Napoleon, we may note the curious, not to say bizarre, exhibition that was offered in the 1840s at 153 Capel Street, Dublin. This was nothing less than, quote, a beautiful mechanical group, the death of Napoleon. And this underlined the macabre Victorian obsession with the last moments of great men. The machine, replete with compression tubes, promised a breathtaking experience in which Napoleon's deathbed scene, his last gasps, would be reenacted. Quote, Napoleon is shown lying on a correct model of his famous bedstead, surrounded by his attendants and confessor. He opens and shuts his eyes, turns his head on the pillow. The heaving of the chest or breathing is very languid. This melancholy scene defies description. It must be seen to be duly appreciated. Other playbills advertised the reenactment of Waterloo, using regular soldiers of the Dublin garrison as extras and with loud explosions promised. As always, Marengo, Napoleon, Josephine, and Wolfe Tone were very much in evidence. Many times, Edward Alexander Gomersall, an actor who bore an uncanny resemblance to Bonaparte and who made an entire career out of playing him, took the lead role. In the last years of the 19th century, in the first decade of the 20th, film made its appearance in Ireland, with patriotic themes very much to the fore, and with frequent representations of Tone, Bonaparte, and Emmet, and, be it said, with very, very many liberties taken with the historical record. At roughly the same time, the indefatigable theatre impresario Kennedy Miller was staging a remarkable number of melodramas of a strongly nationalist bent in the Queen's Theatre, Brunswick Street, Dublin. Among them was Peep of Day. Theobald Wolfe Tone, in this play, Tone survives the rebellion and sails off to Australia with Napoleon and Josephine. Then again, a true son of Erin, the Ulster hero in Sarsfield. By coincidence, or was it, the play Napoleon and Josephine opened in the Queen's Theatre on Easter Saturday, the 22nd of April, 1916, only to be comprehensively upstaged and shut down by another performance nearly 2 days later on Easter Monday. The Irish Rebellion. Napoleon and Josephine reopened 3 weeks later, but to an Ireland that had changed dramatically. And this is, I suppose, is my final point. Was there a connection between the cult of Bonaparte and the Easter Rising? Was Bonaparte in the GPO? It's not difficult to find evidence that at least some of the Irish volunteers, sometimes dubbed the Sinn Féin volunteers, were great admirers of Napoleon Bonaparte. Sean McKeown, later officer commanding the IRA in Longford, in his witness statement to the Bureau of Military History, recalled thinking that, quote, we thought ourselves as valiant as Napoleon, only to be sharply reminded that he was, quote, no pocket Bonaparte going over to conquer England. For his part, volunteer C.J. Macaulay, after observing Joseph Mary Plunkett from his sickbed addressing the volunteer officers gathered around him, caustically remarked that the scene was like Napoleon dictating to his marshals. And when Joseph Good was nipped, actually bitten, on the ear by Michael Collins, he shrugged it off by recalling that Napoleon had a trick of pinching ears. Even Helena Maloney, recollecting the valor of the common man women during the Rising, wrote that at least one of them had done something for which Napoleon would have decorated her. And when Felix O'Doherty from Cork set down his thoughts on the confusion that prevailed in volunteer ranks on Easter Saturday, was the Rising on or off, would we gather or not, he remarked that he could vividly recall that day because he was engrossed in a novel, The Sword Hand of Napoleon, which was set among Bonaparte's retreat from Moscow. So much for the rank and file. What of their officers? The evidence is probably sparser, but nonetheless is suggestive. James Connolly was perhaps an unlikely admirer of Napoleon. He praised the ousting of the Redmondites from the volunteers in 1914 as a brilliant Napoleon-like stroke. But it was Patrick Pearse's enthusiasm for Napoleon that knew no bounds. At St. Enda's, his school in Rathfarnham, He decorated the classroom with pictures and miniature statues of Bonaparte. And he had what amounted to a shrine to the great man in his study. Patrick Pearse recalled that Pearse's prized possession was a lock of Bonaparte's hair. Where is that now? Pearse, according to Cullum, used to say, "Hold your breath while I'm showing you this, the lock of hair." And in the GPO, one witness recalled that Pearse affected a Napoleonic stance with his right hand on his breast. Desmond Ryan, Pearse's first biographer, accepted that Pearse had what he called a Napoleonic complex that expressed itself in a fanatical glorification of war for its own sake. In other ways, too, Pearse expressed his admiration for Bonaparte. He added lines to the Old Grey Mare, a ballad that had been around for some time, that brought Bonaparte into it. At break of day, I chanced to stray, all by the Seine's fair side, when to ease my heart, young Bonaparte came forward for to ride. On a field of green with gallant mien, he formed his men in square, and down the line with looks so fine, he rode his old grey mare. To the Irish poem, O Banatee, to the woman of the house, Pearse added the line, Be Boney in Urran le Fáine an lay. Boney will be in Ireland at daybreak. Pearse was in thrall to a book edited by R.M. Johnson entitled The Corsican. This was a compilation of a diary written by Napoleon, quote, derived entirely from Napoleon's own words, written and spoken, unquote. Now, Johnson candidly admitted that this work, quote, avowedly contravenes rules for the treatment of historical documents, but he maintained even so that it offered psychological illumination of a great career. It also contained comforting words of advice for aspiring military leaders. The art of war, for example, does not require complicated maneuvers. The simplest are the best. Common sense is fundamental. Pearse carried the book with him everywhere. He may even have carried it into the GPO. Patrick Pearse recalled being with Pearse in the Abbey Theatre, and during an interval saw him reading a book entitled The Corsican, that was made from diaries, proclamations, and dispatches of Napoleon. Napoleon's pronouncements on what was appropriate for a military leader would have been useful to Pearse, for though he was director of military operations in the volunteers, he had no military experience whatsoever. Finally, are we certain that the phrase in the Easter Proclamation, referring to our gallant allies in Europe, applied simply to Germany and the other Axis powers? As been frequently noted, Germany itself was not named, nor was Austria-Hungary, nor was Turkey, nor was Bulgaria named. And at his court-martial, following the 1916 rebellion, Pearse flatly rejected the charge that the rising had been timed to assist the German war effort. Germany, he said, is no more to me than England is. Could the phrase, our gallant allies, be a reference to the historic Irish expectation of military assistance from abroad, notably from France? An expectation nurtured over the centuries, brought forward by the recent close study of the revolutionary period, and kept alive by admiration for Bonaparte. Of course, France had been Britain's staunch ally ever since 1904 and the Entente Cordiale, and was fighting bravely along her in the First World War. Yet there was still a view that France remained Ireland's historic friend. James Connolly, as recently as 1915, referred to France as the mother of European democracy, the apostle of the right of rebellion, the century-long sword of the revolution of peoples. There is nothing in his writings to suggest that he reviled France as England's steadfast ally and thus the enemy of a free Ireland. On the contrary, a preoccupation amounting to an obsession with Bonaparte in his times, and by extension a corresponding familiarity with the notion of deliverance from abroad, surely meant that a role by our gallant allies in Europe was all that easier to contemplate and accept. Perhaps Bonaparte stalked the GPO after all. Thank you very much.
Well, many thanks, Tom, for that brilliant lecture, a tour de force covering an extraordinary range of aspects of the relationship between Napoleon and Ireland, from his relatively minor, I suppose, actual impact on the affairs of Ireland in the end, to the extraordinary place he occupied in legend and indeed in myth, and to have vanquished Henry VIII, Oliver Cromwell, and William of Orange was quite a trifecta, as you might say. We have a number of questions, which I will summarise. We don't have a lot of time left, but a few minutes anyway. But just one personal anecdote, which is that recently I was walking near where I live here in Booterstown in Dublin, and walking along, I think it was Avoca Avenue in Blackrock, and I came across a house with a high wall, and the house was called Bonaparte Lodge, and this was perhaps a house of the 19th century, I suspect. So who called it Bonaparte Lodge? I don't know. The other thing, of course, that has to be said from the perspective of the Centre Culturel, or still more the Irish College, is that after the suppression of the Irish College in the early years of the French Revolution, it was Napoleon who actually re-established it. And what's more, he consolidated the English and Scottish colleges into the Irish College as well. And the libraries of those colleges came to the Irish College too. And apparently, again, that it was Napoleon who in the end decreed that the street on which the college stands was no longer to be the Rue du Cheval Vert, but rather the Rue des Irlandais. So a few questions, and I should say, Tom, that you have inspired enough great enthusiasm. In fact, one member of the audience was moved to say, "Long life to Ireland and the Shamrock, vive l'Empereur." So there you are, the spirit remains. A couple of questions here. I'll try to group a couple of them. The first comes to his, the possibility of an Irish invasion. And you may have answered part of this already, but just to recap, first of all, Napoleon's interest in supporting an Irish rebellion was somewhat half-hearted, and in any case, more kind of a strategic feint vis-a-vis the British than a genuine desire to see a revolt and Britain overthrown, ? But secondly, then, related to that, if there had been a successful rising in Ireland supported by the French, would Bonaparte, do you think, have tolerated Irish independence, or would he have installed one of his relatives or generals as king, do you think?
The first question about Napoleon and Irish rebellion, I think we have to be realistic here. Napoleon was a Corsican. He understood the Mediterranean. He understood the land, European continent. He did not know anything about the Atlantic Ocean. And the notion of a French amphibious landing with many thousands of men to Ireland would have terrified him, because the British Navy ruled the waves, and that thus would be bound to end in disaster. Now, a small French incursion would have tied down large numbers of English troops, and perhaps Bonaparte toyed with that. But he just never seems to have taken Ireland all that seriously. I think it intrigued him, but he was more confident being on land in Europe, on the continent. There's a book written 100 years ago, which is by a historian now largely forgotten, J. Holland Rose. And he made a very good point, which I think is that he said that in the Mediterranean, the land commanded the sea. So when Napoleon was at Toulon, which is his first big breakthrough, he was able to bombard the English fleet that comes to Toulon. But in the Atlantic, the sea commands the land. And that's what terrified Bonaparte, that it would be waves, tides, tempests, storms that would have been beyond his control. And I think that's what would have kept him away from it. I mean, he does an amphibious landing in Egypt. But if you look at the detail, it takes him 6 weeks to get from France to Egypt. He carries on all along the line of Italy, all the way down through the south of Italy, hugging the shore the whole way, then leaps for the various islands, and then finally get, I mean, 6 weeks to get to Italy from France. I mean, this is like crazy. He just did not like amphibious operations at all. And I think, therefore, where Ireland was concerned, he was keen perhaps to stir up something that would tie down British troops. What would have happened if there had been a successful invasion? Well, we'll never know. One of my friends always answered this question by saying, if it had happened, we would be looking at the Book of Kells in the Archive Nationale now, in the Bibliothèque Nationale or whatever. That's what would have happened. The other point is more serious, is that Ireland was essential to England. Ireland was not essential to France. So say, run it through, if the French had conquered Ireland and set up a Hibernian republic and so on, at the resultant peace treaty, I suspect Ireland would have been given back to British rule in return for Caribbean islands or some other places. Ireland was essential to England, not essential to France. We don't know. It's a conjecture.
No, thank you very much. A couple of other questions, more to do with Saint Helena, I suppose. I mean, first of all, is there any view as to whether O'Mara's account is actually, accurate and balanced? I suppose nothing much to test it against. And then, did Napoleon, someone asks, ever express a view of Irish regiments in, or Irish soldiers in, the British army as opponents, as enemies?
There are two books written. Barry O'Mara wrote his memoirs, which had a great success. I mean, he had fought with the governor, Hudson Lowe. Now, I describe Hudson Lowe as a martinet and deeply insecure, and I didn't like him at all. Now, there has been recently published a biography of Hudson Lowe, which makes a reasonable case that Hudson Lowe was right to be wary of an escape attempt by Bonaparte. There were people in the United States who were contemplating, we never got around to it, who were planning to launch a couple of ships to St. Helena and capture Bonaparte and bring him back to the US. Now, just how that would have panned out is anyone's guess. But Hudson Lowe, I make him out to be, pretty terrible individual. He may not have been all that bad. Barry O'Mara caught the zeitgeist, if you like. He'd been stationed in Italy in the 1790s. He'd learned Italian. Bonaparte was very much taken with his Italian, and thus he became his medical officer. But like that, he was not about to spy on Bonaparte, monitor his correspondence, monitor anything, try and find out what was going on. Was there a conspiracy afoot? I can't remember the second of your questions there, but
no, it was more, does he ever say anything that we know about his view of Irish troops in the British Army?
You see, you have to say it's possible that Bonaparte didn't really differentiate between Irish and English troops. He doesn't say too much about Ireland. I mean, without Tone's interviews, we would have really very little. And, I've tried to go through his 70, 80 volumes of Napoleon's correspondence, looking for references to Ireland. There doesn't seem to be any. He keeps calling Barry O'Mara an English officer, which in a sense he was. He was an officer of the Royal Navy. But there's no recognition that Ireland was separate from England. And the casual remarks that Ireland was infested with wolves, that the population is 2 million, and that they're all Catholics in Ireland. Well, that's not exactly sort of a brilliant aperçu on the Irish situation. I mean, he's a Corsican, an island, remote area of the Mediterranean. Why would he know about the ins and outs of Irish politics and so on? So,
then, well, just a few sort of points which people have made, not all questions. I don't know, somebody, Fiona Terrace, I don't know if she's known to you or not, but she said, are you aware that Pauline Bonaparte's slippers are in the collection of the University of Aberdeen?
I didn't know that.
Well, there you are. Fiona, I'm sure, can fill you in on that. I don't know Fiona either. But
I didn't know that now. Yeah, I didn't know that.
And then the writer Vona Groark points out interestingly that the narrator of the Frank O'Connor story, Guests of the Nation, is called Bonaparte, of course.
Yeah, I knew that.
He doesn't actually kill the English soldiers whom he is meant to kill. And is this in some way linked to, could this be linked to Napoleon's failure to assist Ireland? I mean, she I think accepts that it may not be a question one can answer, but it's an interesting question.
It's I knew about the Frank O'Connor story and that, and Verona is very good to remind me of that. One of the things that I've enjoyed doing over the last 10 or 15 years is, as I read through various bits and pieces, is picking up the Bonaparte references. Now, I missed the Napoleon Bonaparte slippers. I'm sorry about that. One of the nice ones is George Orwell's Down and Out in London and Paris, where he finds himself pretty much shacked up with an Irishman. And the Irishman asks him a question: who came first, Bonaparte or Jesus Christ? And it's sort of, it's that sort of thing that Bonaparte had entered deeply into the Irish psyche, into the Irish consciousness, as an unknown from an obscure, relatively small, obscure island who conquered half the world. And someone like Pearse, an unknown from a small island, could beat the British Empire. That was the thing that was possible because of Bonaparte. Yeah. So
and and of course Napoleon is one of the leading characters in Animal Farm, as we know.
Yes.
Then somebody just asked, I think maybe a misunderstanding, the Capel Street display of Napoleon. Yeah. That is not still visible anywhere, is it?
No, it's not. But it had suction pipes and so on. Yeah. The Victorians were obsessed with the last moments, the dying moments of great men, especially great men. Lord Shaftesbury gets a similar treatment and so on. And they had various suction compression tubes that would make the figure move and sigh, and people were enthralled at this. They would watch it, and his bedspread and so on. That would be very much what people would be looking for in Ireland. I didn't have a chance to show, but I have a collection of playbills which are very interesting, which show what they were trying to put, what was available to the Irish public throughout the 19th century on Napoleon Bonaparte. Reenactments of Waterloo, great explosions expected, and so on and so forth. And of course, his horse Marengo is top billing, gets top billing in Ireland everywhere. And indeed, the British take to it as well. His skeleton, as I say, is on display in Chelsea National Army Museum in Chelsea. Yeah.
No, I should say, by the way, that Fiona Terrace, you can look at this later, has posted a link to an article about the discovery of Napoleon's slippers in the collection of a man called Robert Wilson. And they are pretty child's size too, according to the article that I can see. So very small. A final question then, a more general one. Kieran McDonald tells me that he was looking for the reference to the display in Capel Street. I don't know if you could share that. Later on, if it's history.
Yeah, it's from a newspaper, or it could be from a playbill. I could check through it.
It's okay. It's okay, Tom. If you find it, I'm sure Kieran will be interested. I think you said it was. Did you say 153 Capel Street? Is that what I remember?
I have it. It's in the National Library playbill.
Okay.
National Library of Ireland playbill number 2/108.
Okay, so you got that, Kieran, I hope. National Library playbill, again, what's the reference? Playbill
number 2/108.
Fine, thank you very much indeed for that. Then a final question, actually asked by Derval MacDonald, who's the chair of the Comité Stratégique and a member of the Fondation Irlandaise, and it's a very wide question. I mean, I suppose Napoleon has, I suppose, by now pretty definitively passed into history. I don't suppose, he has many, he would have quite the impact. Are there many people, I wonder, who suffer from the delusion that they are Napoleon anymore, which used to be the case apparently. But his reputation obviously is now quite strongly contested, and you listed, many of the, if you like, the crimes and the errors which could be laid at his feet. I mean, in a sentence or two, where does his reputation stand now, do you think?
Well,
it's an enormous question, but
you touch on some interesting things. There's a very fine book by Sudhir Nazari Singh on the legend of Napoleon in France, and one of those books which I really enjoyed. He talks about the legend of Napoleon throughout the 19th century in France, and like that, he discovered that some 50% of those incarcerated in French asylums claimed to be Napoleon in the 19th century, to which the answer is many people in Ireland claimed to be Napoleon too. They weren't incarcerated, they were elected to high office instead. But you see in the Times Literary Supplement, I think one of the current issues, there's an article by Nazari Singh on Macron and Napoleon, and that the suggestion is that President Macron is attempting to sort of move himself closer to the image of Napoleon, as a way of establishing sort of center-right credentials, or re-establishing center-right credentials. You see, Bonaparte is infinitely malleable. He can be whatever you want. He's the one who re-established slavery. He's the one who eliminated the First French Republic. But at the same time, in the 100 days, he brought in what could be regarded as a liberal constitution. He overthrew the great emperors. He had a crushing victory at Austerlitz. People can find in Bonaparte whatever they need to reinforce their image of themselves. And that's what makes him so fascinating, really,
Well, look, Tom, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who asked questions and made comments. There have been many very enthusiastic very many very enthusiastic responses and comments, which I think shows just how much people enjoyed it. So it's been a great pleasure, Tom, and let's hope we can get you physically out to Rue des Irlandais at some time before too long. I know that all of us who are connected with the Centre Culturel but based in Dublin would very much like to do that too. So thank you so much, and see you soon. And again, thanks to Nora and the team for setting this up. And if you have any, I see a couple of points coming in. If you have any further questions for Tom or points to raise, you can send them to the Centre Culturel, and they can forward them as appropriate. Okay, thank you so very much indeed. Bye bye then.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye-bye now. Thank you, everyone.